The stagecoach to Tucson left Yuma at 6:30 in the morning, and Martha Whitmore had been awake since 4. She'd spent the pre-dawn hours in her small room at the Yuma boarding house, refolding the same 3 dresses, checking the same leather satchel for the 4th time, running her fingers over the sealed envelope that held everything she'd saved in 6 years of teaching in Ohio. $240, folded neat, tucked behind her teaching credentials, and a letter of recommendation from the Hargrove County School Board. She wasn't a woman who carried money lightly. She knew what each dollar had cost her. The winter she hadn't heated her apartment properly, the shoes she'd repaired 3 times before replacing, the social invitations she'd declined because she couldn't afford the restaurant. $240 represented her entire theory about what her life could become out west. She ate a small breakfast alone in the boarding house kitchen. The landlady, Mrs. Drummond, had already set out cold biscuits and coffee, and then carried her own bags to the street because she didn't want to trouble anyone, and also because she'd learned not to wait for help that rarely materialized for a woman who looked like her. Martha was 31 years old, broad-shouldered, heavy in the hips and belly. With dark brown hair she kept pinned at the nape of her neck, and a face that her mother had once described as handsome in the right light. She'd spent most of her adult life understanding that the right light was apparently scarce. The stagecoach agent at the Yuma depot was a thin young man with a red vest and the particular expression of someone who had checked in enough passengers to categorize them on sight. Martha watched him calculate, not a quick glance, but a full assessment, and she held herself very still while he did it. "Tucson line," she said, setting her bag on the counter. "Name?" "Whitmore, Martha Whitmore. I have a reservation." He found it in his ledger and spent a moment longer than necessary looking at her before he nodded. "Gonna be a full coach. 6 passengers." "That's fine. Gets hot out there. Rough road past the Gila crossing." "I understand." He stamped her ticket without further commentary, and Martha took it and walked to the coach without looking back at him. She'd been having variations of that conversation her entire adult life. The pause, the assessment, the unsolicited warning disguised as helpfulness, and she'd learned that the most effective response was to simply keep moving. The other passengers were already loading when she arrived. A traveling merchant named Osgood, heavy-set himself, but the cheerful sort who seemed comfortable in his own skin, immediately offered to help with her bag and seemed genuinely surprised when she shook her head. A young couple, newlyweds, she could tell by the way they couldn't quite stop touching each other, sat close together inside the coach and nodded politely. An older man in a black coat, some kind of preacher or businessman, kept his eyes on a document he was reading. And then there was the other woman, mid-40s, fine clothes that were dusty from traveling, the careful posture of someone accustomed to being watched. She introduced herself as Mrs. Clara Vance, on her way to join her husband's dry goods enterprise in Tucson. Martha took the backward-facing seat, which no one else wanted, and settled in. The first 2 hours were ordinary. Osgood talked too much. He was the kind of man who filled silence reflexively. And the young couple dozed against each other, and the man in the black coat never looked up from his document. Mrs. Vance and Martha exchanged a few observations about the landscape, which was spare and brutal and beautiful in a way that Martha hadn't been prepared for. She'd grown up in Ohio, where everything was green and managed, where the land had been organized into farms and fences for generations. This was different. The desert didn't care about organization. It didn't care about much of anything. "Have you been to Arizona before?" Mrs. Vance asked. "No, first time." "What brings you out?" "Teaching position, a settlement east of Tucson." She paused. "I hope." Mrs. Vance studied her with the kind of frank curiosity that some women her age had earned the right to express. "You came a long way, on a hope." "I came a long way because the hope seemed worth it." The older woman almost smiled. "Fair enough." They stopped once to water the horses at a station that was barely more than a trough and a shed with a surly attendant. Martha climbed out to stretch her legs and stood in the full desert sun for a few minutes, feeling the weight of it. Not just the heat, which was staggering, but the quality of the silence. In Ohio, silence had texture. Birds, insects, wind in leaves. Here, silence was almost aggressive. It pressed against her ears. She got back in the coach. An hour past the water station, the road curved around a long sandstone ridge, and the horses slowed on the grade. Martha was looking out the small side window at a hawk riding thermals against a white sky when she heard the first rider. Not saw, heard. The particular hollow percussion of hooves on packed dirt, coming fast from somewhere above and to the left. Osgood heard it too. He stopped talking mid-sentence. The coach lurched as the driver up top called something sharp to the horses, and then everything accelerated. The crack of a rifle, the drivers shouting, cutting off abruptly, the coach veering hard to the right as the horses panicked. Martha grabbed the leather strap above the door. The newlywed woman screamed. The man in the black coat finally put down his document. Two riders came alongside the coach. She could see them through the window, and one of them fired into the air, and the horses finally stopped. The silence that followed lasted only a second before a man's voice, flat and businesslike, cut through it. "Everybody out, hands where I can see them." There were 4 of them total. Martha counted as she climbed down from the coach with the other passengers, her hands up, the sun hitting her immediately like a physical pressure. 3 men on horseback, their faces covered with bandanas pulled up to the bridge of their noses. The 4th man was on the ground, holding the lead horse by the bridle while the driver, bleeding from somewhere on his face, still alive but barely holding himself upright on the box, kept very still. The man who seemed to be in charge was young. She could tell from his eyes, which were the only thing exposed above the bandana, and from the way he moved, nervous energy, too much of it, the kind that made situations like this unpredictable. "Bags, purses, watches, all of it in the saddlebag," he gestured with the rifle. "Don't make me ask twice." Osgood complied immediately, pulling off his watch with shaking hands. The man in the black coat surrendered a money clip. The young husband pulled his wife close and handed over what he had, a few dollars, and a ring he clearly didn't want to give. Martha looked at the leather satchel she'd carried off the coach and set on the ground beside her. $240, 6 years. The young leader followed her gaze to the satchel and then looked at her. "That one too." She handed it over. She didn't cry. She'd cried about smaller things than this and knew it didn't help. He rifled through it, fast, efficient, found the envelope of bills, took them and her credentials, and dropped the satchel in the dirt. He didn't even look at the letter of recommendation from the Hargrove County School Board. He just dropped it. "Anybody else holding anything back?" Nobody spoke. The young leader looked along the line of passengers with those 2 bright eyes, and something in his assessment stopped at Martha. He looked at her the way the stagecoach agent had this morning, that same categorizing look, and said something to the rider nearest him, too quiet for her to catch. The other man shook his head slightly. A decision was being made. She could see it happening. "Get back in the coach," the leader said to the other passengers. He didn't say it to Martha. "What about—" the young husband started. "Get in the coach." They moved. Even Osgood, who had been talking for 2 solid hours, went silent and climbed back in. Mrs. Vance turned once to look at Martha and then looked away, and Martha didn't blame her for it. The leader walked toward Martha. She made herself stand still. "You're going to walk," he said. It took her a moment to understand what he meant. "Walk where?" "Any direction that isn't behind us." She looked at the landscape around her. Rock, sand, sparse vegetation. No road, no structure, no shade. The sun directly overhead now. The temperature somewhere north of 100 degrees. "I'll die," she said. She said it plainly, not as an appeal, just as a statement of fact. He looked at her with those young, nervous eyes and said nothing. "At least leave me the canteen," she said. He glanced at the one hanging from her satchel strap on the ground. She'd had the forethought to fill it at the water station. And for a moment she thought he might. Then one of the other riders said something short and impatient, and the leader reached down, picked up the satchel, took the canteen off it, and dropped the satchel again. He kept the canteen. "Walk," he said. The coach pulled away. Martha stood in the desert and watched it go, and the sound of hooves faded, and the silence came back, that aggressive Arizona silence, and she was alone. She started moving. Not because she had a plan, she didn't. She moved because standing still felt like giving in, and she wasn't ready to do that yet. She headed roughly north, away from the road, because she had a vague memory from the driver mentioning something about a ranch in that direction earlier in the trip. She didn't know how far. She didn't know if she'd remembered correctly. The first half hour was manageable. The desert floor was rocky but level, and she was still running on adrenaline, still in the phase where her body was pretending the situation wasn't as serious as it was. By the second half hour, the pretending stopped. The heat was different from anything she'd experienced. Ohio summers were humid and oppressive, but this was dry heat, the kind that pulled moisture out of you so efficiently that you didn't sweat properly. You just desiccated, slowly, like something left on a windowsill. She could feel it happening. Her lips started to crack. Her vision developed a faint shimmer at the edges that she recognized as a warning sign, even if she couldn't remember exactly what it was warning her about. The ground wasn't level anymore. She hadn't noticed the grade when she started, but she was climbing now, slightly, and every step cost more than the last one. Her boots weren't made for this. They were school teacher's boots, sturdy leather, good for classroom floors and cobblestone city streets, not for sand and rock in a 110-degree afternoon. She stopped once to rest against a large rock that provided a narrow strip of shade, pressing her back against the stone and closing her eyes. The rock was still warm from the morning sun. Everything out here held heat. She allowed herself 3 minutes. She counted them. Then she kept walking. An hour in, she thought it was an hour. Time had become unreliable. She found a dry wash and followed it because the ground was easier there. The sand packed hard at the bottom of the channel. She told herself it was going the right direction. She didn't actually know. Her right ankle turned on a half-buried rock, and she went down hard, both palms catching the sand, one knee taking the impact against something harder beneath the surface. She lay there for a moment, face close to the ground, breathing the smell of dust and something faintly mineral. Her knee throbbed. She pressed both palms flat and pushed herself up. The ankle held. She kept moving. She started talking to herself after a while. Not out loud. She wasn't that far gone. But internally, a running commentary. That rock looks like a dog. Put your foot there, not there. You're still breathing. That's something. Put your foot there. She'd done this during hard winters in Ohio, when the school furnace broke down and she'd taught 3 classes in her coat and hat, and told herself the whole time that she was still breathing. That was something. It was a small and slightly ridiculous technique, and it worked better than it should have. The ankle was getting worse. She could feel the swelling starting inside her boot, the leather becoming tight around the joint. She stopped calculating survival odds sometime in the second hour. The math had become unhelpful. She was thinking about water, not in a panicked way, but in the flat, obsessive way of someone whose body was sending persistent signals. When she stepped over a rise and saw the vultures. There were 4 of them, circling in a lazy thermal maybe a quarter mile to the east. She stopped and watched them. They were patient things, vultures. They didn't rush. They knew how to wait. She looked at them for a long moment, and something cold settled in her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. They're not here for me yet, she thought. Get moving. Cole Mercer saw the birds from the saddle of his horse, Compass, at a distance he estimated at about 2 miles. He'd been riding the eastern fence line of the Bitter Creek Ranch since mid-morning, checking for breaks after the windstorm 3 nights ago. It was tedious work that he generally assigned to one of the younger hands, but 2 of his men were laid up with a stomach illness that had swept through the bunkhouse, and the 3rd was in Yuma picking up a part for the windmill pump, so Cole was doing it himself. He was 43 years old and had been doing the work of 2 or 3 men for so long that solitude felt like his natural state. He reined up when he spotted the vultures and sat very still, watching. 4 birds. Patient pattern. Not yet descended, which meant whatever they were waiting on was still living, or had died recently enough that they were being cautious. He looked at the terrain. Rocky ground, a dry wash cutting through the flats, scrub brush. No obvious carcass visible from here, which meant whatever it was had found shelter of some kind. A wash, a depression in the ground. He turned compass east. He told himself it was probably a steer. They lost cattle occasionally to the heat, and to snakes, and to the random catastrophic bad luck that was the frontier's baseline operating condition. He told himself this with the practiced conviction of someone who knew better, and was choosing to think hopefully anyway. It took him 15 minutes to cover the distance. The vultures shifted when he approached, rising a little higher but not leaving entirely. They had committed to whatever this was, and they weren't giving it up easily. He almost missed her. She was in the shadow of a sandstone outcropping, sitting with her back against the rock and her legs stretched in front of her. Her dress was dark with sweat, one palm pressed to her knee, her head not quite upright. From a distance, she looked like a bundle of discarded cloth. Then she moved. Just her head, turning toward the sound of hooves. Cole pulled Compass up short and swung down from the saddle in one motion, which he was aware looked more graceful than he actually felt. His knees weren't what they'd been. He closed the distance between them in a few long strides and crouched down in front of her. She looked at him with eyes that were squinting against the light, her pupils small and contracted, which was bad, which meant the heat was already doing work on her. Her lips were cracked. Her face was flushed in the uneven, patchy way that meant dehydration, not sunburn. She was a large woman, he registered, with a dark severity to her features that might have been intimidating in different circumstances. Right now, she just looked exhausted and angry and very close to the edge of something he didn't want to watch happen. "Ma'am," he said. He didn't know what else to lead with. She looked at him steadily. "I was on the Tucson stage," she said. Her voice came out rough. "Robbed. They left me." "How long ago?" 2 hours? Maybe 3? I don't... She paused, recalibrated. "I'm not sure." He already had his canteen out. She took it without hesitation and drank. Not recklessly, but steadily. And he watched her force herself to stop after 4 swallows when what she clearly wanted was to drain it. "Smart," he said. "I know better than to make myself sick." She handed it back. "I need to rest. I can walk again in a few minutes." He looked at her ankle, which was visible below her hem and was not a normal ankle shape anymore. He looked at the terrain between here and his ranch. He looked at the sun, which was not getting any lower. "You're not walking anywhere," he said. "My ranch is about 4 miles north. You're riding." She looked at his horse, then at herself, then back at him with the expression of someone running a calculation they didn't like the result of. "I'm not a small woman," she said. There was something specific in how she said it. Not self-deprecating, not apologetic, just matter-of-fact, like she was giving him information she expected to be relevant. "Compass has carried fence posts," Cole said. "He'll manage." It came out shorter than he intended. He wasn't dismissing her concern. He understood she was raising a practical issue, not fishing for reassurance. He just wasn't built for the kind of conversation that required him to navigate around the thing being said. She looked at him for another moment, assessing, and then she nodded. All right. Getting her onto the horse was not graceful. Her knee was worse than she'd let on, and the ankle complicated her ability to push off. And Cole ended up essentially lifting her from below while she grabbed the saddle horn with both hands and hauled herself up. She made a sound that was almost but not quite suppressed when her knee bent at the wrong angle. He pretended not to hear it. He walked. He'd offered to ride behind her, but she'd said the horse would be slower with 2, and she was right. Compass was a good horse, but not a large one, and 4 miles in the afternoon heat with a single rider was enough of an ask. So Cole walked beside them, one hand on the bridle, and they moved north across the desert floor at a pace that was slower than he wanted and faster than she'd have been able to manage on her own. She didn't make conversation. He appreciated that. Some people, in a crisis, needed to talk constantly. He understood it, the talk as proof of continuing function. But she seemed to be the other kind, the kind who went internal when things were hard. After about 20 minutes, she spoke. "Cole Mercer," he said, preempting the question. She paused. "I didn't ask." "You were about to." Another pause. "Martha Whitmore." "Where were you headed?" "Teaching position. Settlement east of Tucson." A beat. "I had a letter of recommendation. References. All my savings." She stopped there, the flat recitation of loss. He didn't say he was sorry. He'd noticed she didn't seem to want that kind of response. He said, "You remember what any of the men looked like?" 3 riders, 1 ground man. The leader was young, early 20s maybe, brown eyes visible above the bandana. The others I didn't see well. "Which direction did they go after?" "South from the road. Toward the border, I'd guess." He filed that. He knew a deputy in the county seat who might be interested, though he also knew how often stagecoach robberies in this part of Arizona territory actually resulted in recovery of stolen property, which was rarely and sometimes never. The ranch buildings became visible through the heat shimmer after another hour. A main house of adobe, a barn, several outbuildings, a windmill turning slowly in the light afternoon breeze. Martha straightened slightly on the horse when she saw them. "That's Bitter Creek," Cole said. "You run it yourself?" "With a small crew, 3 hands usually, when they're all healthy." "How many acres?" He told her. She absorbed the number without comment, but he noticed she was looking at the layout of the buildings with attention. The placement of the barn relative to the house, the catchment system for rainwater, the kitchen garden that one of his hands had started 2 seasons ago, and that Cole had continued mostly out of guilt after the man left. She was looking at the ranch the way someone looked at a problem they were interested in solving. He didn't know what to make of that. He put her in the room at the back of the house that he'd been using for storage, which took him 45 minutes to clear while she sat at the kitchen table and drank water slowly and methodically. He brought out a cot, a blanket despite the heat, desert nights got cold fast, and a basin and pitcher from the main bedroom. He found a small jar of liniment in the cabinet under the washstand and brought that too. "You'll need to get the boot off that ankle," he said, setting the liniment on the floor near the cot. "I know. The swelling might—" "I know," she said again, and something in her tone suggested she'd been taking care of herself for a long time and didn't need the process narrated. He nodded and left her to it. He heard her inhale sharply through the wall at one point, the boot coming off, he assumed, and then quiet. He was in the kitchen putting together something for supper, which he was not good at. He could cook 4 things competently: beans, salt pork, biscuits that were adequate rather than good, and coffee. He made all of them. It wasn't much of a meal, but it was hot, and there was enough of it. She emerged from the back room walking with a careful, deliberate gait that was distributing weight off the ankle. She'd changed into a different dress. She must have had a small bag, he realized, that had stayed on the coach, and she'd unpinned her hair and repinned it. She looked less like someone who had been lost in the desert, though she didn't yet look entirely like someone who hadn't been. She sat down at the table without being asked and looked at the food. "Thank you," she said, "for the food in the room. It's not much. It's more than I had 2 hours ago." He sat down across from her, and they ate without talking for a while. Outside, the desert was doing the thing it did at dusk, cooling rapidly, the colors shifting from white to orange to something darker, the shadows stretching long across the sand. "What happens to you now?" Cole said. He hadn't meant to ask it that directly, but there it was. She was quiet for a moment, a spoonful of beans held over her bowl. Then she set it down. "That's what I'm trying to figure out. The teaching position. Did they know you were coming?" "A letter. But I was 3 weeks in transit. They may have found someone else by now." She paused. "Even if they haven't, I can't get there without money, and I can't get money without working, and I can't work without—" She stopped, recalibrated. It's a problem with no easy first step. He looked at her ankle, which was wrapped now. She'd done a decent job with strips of cloth she must have cut from something. And at her hands, which were crossed on the table and were not the hands of a woman who was afraid of work. Broad palms, short practical nails, a small scar along the left index finger. He didn't say what he was thinking. He'd known this woman for 5 hours, and he'd learned that the kind of thinking he was doing, "I could offer her work here, just until she's back on her feet," had to be offered carefully if it was offered at all, because it could come across in ways he didn't intend. "Rest tonight," he said instead. "There's time to figure the rest of it out." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. It was something between suspicion and relief, and he wasn't sure which one she was more comfortable with, and then nodded. "All right," she said. "Tonight." He woke at 4:30, which was his habit, and found her already in the kitchen. She'd found the coffee and made it, and she was sitting at the table with a piece of paper and a stub of pencil, writing something. She looked up when he came in and said, "I hope you don't mind. I couldn't sleep." "I don't mind." He poured a cup. The coffee was better than his. He noted this without comment. "I've been making a list," she said. "Of what?" She turned the paper toward him. It was a list of tasks written in a clear, compact hand. He read through it. Things like check-catch system capacity, winterization of garden beds, roof assessment on barn east wall, and looked at her. "I was looking out the window," she said. "A few things caught my attention." "You were looking at my ranch at 4:30 in the morning. I woke up at 2. He sat down across from her with his coffee and looked at the list again. Some of what she'd written was accurate. The barn roof had been a concern since last fall. He hadn't gotten to the garden beds. Some of it was things she couldn't possibly know from looking. "The catch system capacity is fine," he said. "We upgraded the cistern last spring." "Good. Then cross it off." She didn't reach for the paper. She waited. He picked up the pencil and crossed it off. It was a strange moment. He wasn't sure why he'd done it. "The barn roof," he said. "You know about it. I've been meaning to get to it before winter. You have 3 months." He looked at her. She looked back at him with the direct, slightly challenging attention of someone who was very comfortable knowing things. "You always do this?" he asked. "Inventory other people's problems before breakfast?" She almost smiled. I was a school teacher for 6 years. You spend 6 years evaluating what's working and what isn't. You start doing it automatically. He drank his coffee and thought about that. Why Arizona? He asked. You could have taken a position closer to home. She was quiet for a moment. I wanted to be somewhere that didn't already have an opinion of me. He didn't ask her to explain that. He understood the shape of it, the wanting to start without the weight of everyone's accumulated assumptions. He'd come to Arizona territory himself for something in that neighborhood, though his reasons were different. What about you? She said. You've been out here long. 12 years. Alone the whole time? Had a crew. Lost some, replaced some. A pause. My wife died. 8 years ago, before the ranch. He didn't know why he'd said that. It wasn't a thing he volunteered. She didn't say she was sorry. She said, was she the reason you came west? We came together. She wanted Arizona. Then you stayed. Then I stayed. They sat with that for a while. The desert outside was starting to lighten, the sky shifting from black to dark blue to a thin line of pale gold at the eastern edge. The teaching position, she said finally. If it's gone, if they found someone else, I'd need work. Something that pays enough to rebuild what was taken. She paused. I can cook. I can manage a household. I can keep books. I did the school district's accounts for 2 years. He'd been waiting for this to come up. He'd been wondering how she'd raise it. My cook left 6 weeks ago, he said. Went to California. Is that an offer? It's a fact. She looked at him steadily. Then turn it into one. He looked at her, at the exhaustion still apparent around her eyes, at the straight set of her spine despite it, at the pencil still in her hand and the list still on the table between them. And he said, room, meals, and $12 a month, kitchen and house. You keep the books if you're willing, you leave when you're ready. She considered it. He watched her consider it, which was itself something. She didn't rush, she didn't perform gratitude or excitement, she just sat with the offer and thought about it clearly. $14, she said. He blinked. What? I said 14. You need someone who can cook, manage a household, and keep your accounts. That's 3 jobs. $14. He stared at her. You can say no, she added. He said, 13. She thought about it. 13 and you replace the kitchen lamp. The wick is almost gone. He almost, not quite, but almost laughed. Fine. Then yes, she said. It's an agreement. She put the pencil down and picked up her coffee, and Cole Mercer sat across from her at his kitchen table in the early Arizona morning and felt, for the first time in a long while, that something had shifted in the particular gravity of his days. He couldn't have said exactly what. He just knew the kitchen felt less empty than it had yesterday, and it wasn't the coffee. Outside, the vultures that had been circling over the desert the afternoon before were gone. They'd given up on whatever they'd been waiting for. They were wrong to count her out. They always were. The lampwick arrived 3 days later, delivered by a supply rider from the general store in the nearest town, a small place called Red Rock Crossing that sat about 8 miles west of Bitter Creek along the main road. Cole had sent a list with the rider the morning after his agreement with Martha, and when the man returned with the wick and the other supplies, Cole installed it in the kitchen lamp without ceremony and didn't mention it again. Martha noticed. She didn't mention it either. That was roughly speaking how the first 2 weeks at Bitter Creek went. A series of small, practical things accomplished without much conversation. Each one a kind of quiet acknowledgement that the arrangement was real and that both of them intended to hold up their end of it. Her ankle kept her off it for the first 4 days, which she found intolerable. She'd wrapped it herself with strips torn from an old petticoat and propped it on a wooden box under the kitchen table while she worked sitting down, peeling potatoes, shelling the dried beans she'd found in the pantry, sorting through the household accounts that Cole had kept in a tin box beside the stove, with the organizational logic of someone who found paperwork actively threatening. The accounts were not a disaster, but they were close. She spread them across the table and spent an afternoon putting them into order, and when Cole came in at supper time and saw what she'd done, he stood in the doorway for a moment before he said anything. I know where everything is, he said. You knew where everything was, she said. Now you know where everything is and what it means. He sat down and looked at the organized ledgers. He picked up one page, read it, set it down. He didn't say thank you exactly, but he said, Harmon's been overcharging on the feed corn, which meant he'd understood it. By about 11%, Martha said, consistently, over 14 months. Either he's testing how closely you read the invoices or he's decided you don't. Cole's jaw did something specific. I'll talk to him. You might want to decide first whether you want to keep his feed supply and negotiate, or find a different supplier and cut the relationship. He looked at her. Do you have an opinion? Not yet. I don't know enough about your options, but I can have one by Thursday if you tell me who else sells feed corn in reasonable distance. He told her 2 names. She wrote them down. By Thursday, she had a recommendation, and Cole followed it, and the savings over the subsequent months worked out to something meaningful. Martha noted this in the ledger without editorializing. By the end of the first week, she was walking on the ankle, carefully, with a slight compensating shift in her gait that she was aware of and working to correct. Cole's 3 ranch hands had returned to full health and full complement. A young man named Dusty, who was 19 and talked about horses the way other men talked about women, with reverence and a degree of obsession that suggested unmet need. A quiet Mexican man named Esteban, who'd been with Cole for 6 years and communicated primarily in precise, economical statements. And the third, a man in his mid-30s named Walt, who had been a soldier before this and still carried himself that way. Straight back, even movements, a quality of watchfulness that didn't quite relax even when he was sitting still. They received her with varying degrees of comfort. Dusty was easy. He had the uncomplicated acceptance of someone young enough to not yet have fully absorbed the lessons he was supposed to have about who was and wasn't worth his attention. He thanked her for the first meal she cooked, beans and salt pork, because she was working with what was in the pantry. With genuine enthusiasm, as if it were the best thing he'd eaten in weeks. Given what she'd learned about Cole's previous cooking, it probably was. Esteban was respectful in a contained way, nodding when she was introduced, eating what she cooked without complaint, occasionally offering short sentences that turned out, on reflection, to be useful information about ranch operations. She came to appreciate his brevity. He said things once and meant them. Walt was the harder one. He wasn't rude. He was too disciplined for rudeness, but he had the particular stillness of a man who was reserving judgment and making clear that he was doing so. He watched her move around the kitchen the first few days with the expression of someone monitoring a situation for potential complications. She'd met men like Walt before. Former soldiers sometimes got that way. Not mean, just cautious in a manner that had calcified into something close to suspicion. She cooked consistently good meals and kept the house clean and didn't ask anyone to treat her differently, and by the end of the second week, Walt had started saying thank you at meals, which she understood was not a small concession for him. The thing she hadn't expected was the heat. She'd known Arizona was hot. She'd read about it. She'd experienced the stagecoach attack in it. But living in it, working in it, being in a kitchen with a wood stove burning in it, was a different education entirely. Ohio summers were hot too, but they were the kind of hot that broke at night and eased in the mornings. Arizona heat was relentless, a full-time condition rather than a daily event. By 8 in the morning, the air outside was already warm. By 10, it was serious. By noon, it was a physical fact you negotiated with rather than experienced. She cooked the big midday meal early, before the kitchen became unbearable, and let things sit covered and warm. She moved the wash outside, under the narrow strip of shade from the barn overhang. She learned to stop working when she needed to, and sit with a wet cloth at the back of her neck and not treat it as a failure of character. That last lesson took longer than the others. Her body was not built for this climate. She knew it in the practical sense. She retained heat. She tired more quickly in extreme temperatures. The work of moving her weight across the desert floor cost her more than it would have cost a smaller woman. She'd known this about herself for years, and she'd developed a precise, unsentimental accounting of what it meant. She had to plan differently, rest strategically, push through some things that others didn't have to push through, and refuse to let any of that become the story she told about herself. One afternoon in the third week, she was hauling water from the cistern to the kitchen garden. 2 buckets, because 1 trip was more efficient than 2, and Dusty appeared from nowhere, reaching for the nearest bucket. "I can take that, Miss Whitmore." She didn't stop walking. "I've got it." "It's heavy?" "I know." She kept moving. "It's always been heavy." He fell back, looking uncertain, and she felt a small stab of something that might have been guilt. He was 19, and he meant well. So she said over her shoulder, "You can get the second trip if you want something to do." He did, and that became the pattern. She didn't ask for help, and she didn't refuse it when it was offered reasonably, but she set the terms. She was aware in the back of her mind that she was establishing something, demonstrating through repeated daily action that she could carry what she carried. Not for their benefit, or not only for it. Mostly for her own. Cole watched this without comment. That was something she'd noticed about him. He observed more than he spoke, and what he observed didn't immediately translate into action or opinion. He was the kind of man who let things accumulate before he decided what they meant. She wasn't entirely sure what to make of him. He was not warm, in the way that word usually implied. He didn't make conversation for its own sake, didn't ask about her history, or her family, or her life before Arizona. But he was attentive in the practical sense. He fixed the kitchen window latch without being asked when she mentioned once that it was sticking. He made sure the back room she slept in had a working bolt on the door. He relayed information she needed about the ranch and about the county without filtering it for her comfort. He treated her, she eventually realized, with a form of respect that was more meaningful for being unarticulated. He assumed she could handle what came at her. She also noticed that he worked harder than she'd expected the owner of a ranch to work. He was up before her every morning, and she was up early, and he was often still out when she went to sleep. He could do most things his hands could do, and some things better. He didn't delegate from a distance. She'd watched him mend fence in the full midday sun, working steadily without complaining, and she'd thought, that's a man who doesn't know how to ask for rest, and then recognized the sentiment because she had a similar problem herself. One evening, about 3 weeks in, she found him sitting on the porch after supper with a cup of coffee and nothing else. No task in his hands, no visible purpose, and it struck her as so unusual that she stopped in the doorway. "You're just sitting," she said. He looked up. "Is that a problem?" "No, I've just not seen you do it before." He looked back out at the desert. The sun was going down, the sky moving through its evening colors. "I do it sometimes, when I remember to." She almost went back inside. Instead, for reasons she didn't examine closely, she pulled the other chair away from the wall and sat down. They didn't talk for a while. The desert at dusk had its own sounds, insects starting up, a distant coyote, the windmill turning slowly. And it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who were both somewhat accustomed to their own company. "Your wife," she said eventually. "Did she like it out here?" He was quiet for a moment. "She did. She liked the space. She said Ohio felt like being inside a box." "That's accurate." "Were you from a small town?" "Middling. Big enough to have opinions about everyone." She paused. "My family thought coming west was foolish. My mother especially." "What did she think you should do?" "Marry someone appropriate and teach school close enough to visit on holidays." Martha looked at her hands in her lap. "I did the teaching part. But not the marriage. There was a man, some years ago." She said it flatly, without prelude or apology. "He was a good man in the ways that show, less good in the ways that don't." Cole didn't ask her to elaborate. She appreciated that. "What happened with the ranch after your wife?" she asked. Not because she was prying, but because the question seemed to fit the same register as what she'd offered. "I worked," he said. "That's mostly what happened." "For 8 years." "More or less." She looked at his profile. The square jaw, the deep-set eyes, the way the lines around his mouth suggested both that he'd laughed sometime in his life and that it had been a while. He wasn't a handsome man in the way that meant easy or comfortable to look at. He was the other kind, the kind whose face had been arranged by weather and work and time into something that communicated history rather than aesthetics. "You're not going to ask me if I'm all right," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Are you?" "I don't know." "Probably. Mostly." He drank his coffee. "People ask that and they want a yes, so I give them a yes." "I don't want a yes particularly." "No," he said. "I noticed that about you." The insects got louder as the light faded, and Martha sat with the strange, slightly disorienting sensation of being, for the first time since she'd stepped onto that stagecoach in Yuma, something other than in crisis. The letter from Mill Haven Settlement arrived on a Tuesday, delivered with the mail rider who came out to Bitter Creek twice monthly. Martha recognized the return address. It was the settlement east of Tucson, the place she'd been headed, the teaching position she'd applied for from Ohio 3 months ago. She stood in the yard holding it and looked at the handwriting on the front, which was neat and official, and she turned it over in her hands twice before she opened it. She read it standing up, in the yard, in the sun. The school board at Millhaven Settlement expressed their regret. The position had been filled in late April when it became apparent, given the lack of further correspondence from Miss Whitmore, that she would not be arriving. They wished her well in her endeavors and trusted she had found satisfactory arrangements. Martha read it twice. Then she folded it along its original creases and put it in her apron pocket and went back into the kitchen, where she had bread rising. She checked the bread. It needed another hour. She sat down at the kitchen table and looked at the wall for a while. Cole came in for water around mid-morning, the way he usually did, and he stopped when he saw her face. She hadn't arranged it into anything. She hadn't had the energy. "What happened?" he said. She pulled the letter from her pocket and set it on the table without comment. He read it standing up, which was slightly awkward because he had to lean over, and then he straightened. "I'm sorry," he said. "It's not your fault." "I know it's not. I'm still sorry it happened." She looked at him. He said it simply and without visible discomfort, which was not how he usually communicated. He was a man who had to work himself up to words, she'd observed, and it cost him something small but real. She registered this. "It was the position I'd planned around," she said. "Not just the job. The plan." She stopped. "I had a sequence. I'd arrive, I'd establish myself, I'd be known as the teacher from Ohio who'd come west. Not the woman from the stagecoach robbery who ended up working at someone's ranch because she had nowhere else to go." Cole pulled the chair out and sat across from her. He didn't say the plan could be rebuilt, which was probably true, but wasn't what she needed to hear right now. He didn't say Arizona had other settlements with schools, which was also probably true and also not helpful. He said, "What does the sequence need now?" She looked at him. "What?" "Your plan had a sequence. This part of it's gone. What does the sequence need to become?" She sat with that. It was a different kind of question from what she'd expected, and it pulled her brain out of the place where it had been cycling. Grief, frustration, the specific bitterness of a loss that felt both random and personal, and into something more operational. "I need credentials that are accepted here," she said slowly. "Arizona territory has different requirements than Ohio. I didn't know that until I started reading what I could find in your library." "I have a library?" "You have 47 books in a box in the back storage room. That counts." He almost smiled. "I need a local reference," she continued. "Someone in the territory who can vouch for me to a school board here. And I need a position that's actually available, which means I need to know what's out there." "Red Rock Crossing has been without a teacher for 2 seasons, Cole said. She looked up. "What?" "The school building's been sitting empty. Town's been splitting the older children between 2 families who have some education, but it's not working well." He paused. "I heard it from the postmaster last month." Martha was quiet. "Why didn't you mention it?" "I didn't know if you were interested in staying. You said you'd leave when you were ready. You could have mentioned it. You could have asked." They looked at each other with the particular friction of 2 people who were both slightly right and knew it. "Tell me about the school board," she said. Red Rock Crossing was not an impressive town, but it was a real one. A main street with a general store, a blacksmith, a post office, a saloon that also functioned as the town's informal meeting hall, and a church that held services on alternate Sundays when the circuit preacher came through. The school was a single room set back from the main street on a lot that the town had designated for educational purposes years ago, when the settlement was optimistic about its own growth. The building had a sound roof and 2 good windows and a stove that Esteban reported was still functional when Cole sent him to look at it. Martha rode with Cole to Red Rock Crossing on a Thursday morning. It was her first time on horseback since the day he'd brought her to the ranch, and she was conscious of the horse, a steadier mare than Compass, one of the 2 Cole kept for general use, adjusting to her weight, the animal's ears flicking back once before settling. She sat straight and said nothing about it. The town took notice of them arriving. She registered the attention without making eye contact. There were 3 women on the general store porch whose conversation stopped with observable completeness when the horses came down the main street, and she kept her face neutral and her spine straight. The town chairman was a man named Bernard Hollis, who ran the general store and had the satisfied, slightly cushioned look of a man who'd built something and knew it. He shook Cole's hand first and then, with visible recalibration, shook Martha's. "Miss Whitmore," Cole said, introducing her without ceremony. "She's been keeping my accounts and my household for the past month. She has 6 years of teaching in Ohio and credentials from the Hargrove County School Board, which were unfortunately taken in the robbery she experienced coming through. I can vouch for her personally. Hollis looked at her. She had noticed that men of his type did a specific kind of looking, a comprehensive once-over that they thought was subtle, and she let him finish and then said, I understand the position has been unfilled for 2 seasons. That's right. What happened to the previous teacher? Got married. Husband didn't want her working. And since then you've had families filling in? 2 families, yes, the Harpers and the Deacons. Good people, but you understand they have their own responsibilities. How many children of school age? 14 at last count. Could be 17 by fall if the Prescott family moves their clan up from Tucson the way they've been talking about. Martha nodded. I'd like to see the schoolroom. He showed her the building, which was dusty from disuse but sound. She walked through it slowly, testing floorboards, checking the stove, looking at the window placement for light. There were still slates on a shelf along the back wall, half a box of chalk, and a McGuffey reader with a broken spine. She picked up the reader and looked at it. The children's levels vary, she said, considerably. That's fine. I've worked with mixed-age classrooms. She set the reader down. I'll need a reliable stove, more chalk, and 3 new primers by October. The rest I can work with. Hollis looked at her for a moment, then at Cole, then back at her. The pay is $10 a month. Board is usually handled by a family in town, rotation. $12, Martha said. And I can arrange my own board. Cole said nothing. He was standing near the door with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man watching something with interest. Hollis frowned. The previous teacher got 10. The previous teacher had a husband who paid for her boots. I don't. She met his eyes steadily. $12, Mr. Hollis. The children in this town haven't had consistent instruction in 2 years. You know what that cost them. There was a pause. Hollis had the look of a man who was making a decision he wasn't entirely comfortable with, but could see the logic of. I'll need to bring it to the other board members. Of course. I'll expect an answer by next Tuesday. She walked back out into the sunlight, and Cole fell into step beside her, and they walked in silence to where the horses were hitched before he said quietly, $12. I'm worth $12. I didn't say you weren't. She looked at him sidelong. You were thinking it. I was thinking you've got a lot of nerve for someone who's been in Arizona territory for a month. I've been alive for 31 years, she said. The nerve was already there. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in that direction, and they untied the horses and rode back toward Bitter Creek through the late morning heat. The answer came back yes on Monday, a day early, delivered by the mail rider with a note from Hollis that was brief and businesslike and included the words terms as discussed without further commentary. Martha read it at the kitchen table and sat with it for a while. $11, she'd said to herself honestly. She'd expected 11, with Hollis holding back 1 as a point of principle. The 12 surprised her. She thought about what it meant. Dusty was in the kitchen getting water when she read the letter, and he saw her face and said, Good news? Yes. What kind? The kind that means I'll be leaving here in the fall. She folded the letter. I'll be teaching school in Red Rock Crossing. Dusty's face went through something complicated. He was the youngest of them, and she'd become, she suspected, something like an older sister to him in the month she'd been there. Someone who fed him properly, and listened when he talked about horses and didn't treat him like he was stupid, which apparently not everyone had done. He said, Oh, and then, after a pause, That's good, though. For you. It is. When? September. The school year starts mid-September. He nodded and took his water and went back outside, and Martha looked at the letter one more time. September was 6 weeks away. She was surprised to find the thought of leaving brought something she hadn't quite anticipated. Not regret exactly, but something in that territory. She'd built a routine here, and routines were harder to leave than she'd expected. The kitchen that she'd reorganized to make sense, the accounts that were now clean and current, the garden beds she'd gotten Dusty to help her turn over, which were producing with more enthusiasm than Cole had expected. The evenings on the porch when she and Cole sat with the desert settling into dark around them, and talked about nothing in particular, or didn't talk at all. She told Cole that evening, on the porch. He was on his usual chair, coffee in hand, and she pulled hers out and sat and looked at the sky and then said, I heard from Hollis. They've confirmed the position. A beat. At 12. At 12. He nodded. He looked at the desert. She looked at it too. September, she said. That's 6 weeks. Yes. Neither of them said anything for a while. The coyotes started somewhere in the middle distance, a thin, rising sound that the desert flung up at a purple sky. You'll need a place to stay in town, he said. Hollis mentioned a widow who takes boarders. I'll look at the room when I go back. I'll drive you in. You don't have to. Martha. He said her name with a kind of brevity that cut through her sentence. It was the first time he'd used her first name. She was aware of that. I'll drive you in. She looked at him. His profile in the evening light was the same as it always was. Set, weather-worn, giving away very little. All right, she said. The night settled around them and the stars came up, and the stove in the kitchen was still faintly warm at the core of the house behind them. And Martha Whitmore sat on the porch of a ranch she'd never planned to come to and thought about what it meant to want something you hadn't intended to want. She hadn't planned for this place. She hadn't planned for any of it. The robbery, the desert, the man who'd ridden toward Vultures because he couldn't look away from what needed doing. The plan she'd brought with her from Ohio was gone. That was true. What was left was something she hadn't had a name for yet. She was working on finding one. The 6 weeks passed the way difficult things often do. Faster than expected and slower than felt comfortable. Martha had thought the time between Hollis's confirmation letter and September would feel like a clear runway, a defined stretch of preparation before the next phase of her life began. Instead, it felt like something she was moving through at an angle, aware of the ground shifting under her feet in ways she hadn't planned for and wasn't entirely sure how to name. She kept working. That part was straightforward. The kitchen, the accounts, the meals, the garden that had become something she was genuinely invested in, despite knowing she'd be leaving it to whoever or whatever came after her. Dusty had taken to checking on it in the evenings, which she suspected was his way of staying connected to the routine she'd built around him. He'd never say so. He was 19 and from somewhere in Texas where men his age had strict opinions about what they were and weren't sentimental about. Walt had softened considerably by the 5th week, which she counted as a minor personal victory. He'd started leaving his coffee cup on the kitchen counter in the mornings rather than washing it himself, a small surrender of independence that she understood, from long observation of men like him, meant he'd decided she was trustworthy. He also once asked her opinion about a letter he was writing to his sister in Missouri, which he'd been working on for 3 weeks and couldn't get to sound right. She'd read it and suggested 2 small changes and said it was a good letter, which it was, and he'd folded it up without thanking her but with an expression of relief that was thanks enough. Esteban remained Esteban, precise, economical, reliable, in the way of a well-made tool. She'd come to value him enormously. He spoke when speech was useful and was silent when it wasn't, and she'd begun to understand through accumulated small moments that his silences contained more attention than most people's full sentences. Cole she thought about more than she intended to. This was inconvenient. She'd been aware of the direction things were moving in, had been aware of it since roughly the 2nd week, when she'd sat across from him at the kitchen table at 4:30 in the morning and watched him cross items off her list with a borrowed pencil. But awareness and management were different skills. She could observe the feeling without acting on it, the same way she'd learned to observe the heat without surrendering to it. That was the plan, anyway. The problem was that the plan required Cole to be predictable, and he was proving somewhat less predictable than she'd initially assessed. It was not dramatic. He didn't say things he shouldn't say or look at her in ways that required addressing. He was, if anything, even more careful in the final weeks than he'd been before, as if he too was aware of the clock running down and had decided the most reasonable response to that was restraint. But the restraint itself had a quality to it. It was deliberate. She could feel the effort behind it the same way you could feel the shape of something under a cloth by the way the cloth fell. He drove her to Red Rock Crossing on a Wednesday in mid-August, as he'd said he would, to look at the widow's room. The widow was named Mrs. Pelham, and she was 70-something and sharp as a tack and deeply uninterested in pretense of any kind. She showed Martha the room, small but clean, with a window that faced east, which Martha liked, and quoted her a price that was entirely reasonable and then said, "I don't want noise after 9 at night or cooking in the room. Other than that, I don't much care what you do." "That suits me," Martha said. "Good. When do you want it?" "September 1st. "Fine." It was done in under 20 minutes. Martha and Cole walked back to where the wagon was hitched, and he helped her up, his hand under her elbow, a brief and practical contact, and they started back toward Bitter Creek. They were halfway there when he said, Pelham's a good woman. She'll leave you alone. That's what I want. Is it? She looked at him. It hadn't quite been a question. What does that mean? She said. He kept his eyes on the road. The horses moved at their steady pace, the wagon wheels throwing up small puffs of dust that the light afternoon breeze took and dispersed. Nothing. Just, you've spent a month at the ranch, and you don't seem like someone who needs a lot of alone. She thought about this. I've needed it at various points in my life. I'm better at it than I used to be. That's not the same as wanting it. No, she said. It's not. The road curved around the edge of a sandstone rise, and the ranch buildings came into view in the distance. The adobe walls, the windmill, the thin line of the kitchen garden against the pale ground. And Martha looked at it with the odd doubled sensation of seeing a place both as it was and as it was going to be. A place she was leaving, that she had never planned to come to, that had become something she hadn't expected. She didn't say any of that. Cole didn't say anything either. They drove the rest of the way in a silence that had so much inside it that it was almost loud. The trouble started on a Saturday, 11 days before she was scheduled to leave. She'd gone into Red Rock Crossing alone, on the steadier mare, to pick up supplies and settle a few things with Hollis before the school year began. She was at the general store, working through a list of items she needed, when she heard the conversation happening in the back corner of the store behind a shelf of dry goods. Two women. She recognized one of them, a Mrs. Alderman, whose husband ran the town's only saloon. The other she didn't know. They were speaking at the volume of women who believe they're out of earshot. Can't imagine what Cole Mercer is thinking, keeping a woman like that at his ranch all this time. Well, she had nowhere else to go, so he took her in, which is charitable, I suppose. Charitable. A pause waited with a specific kind of meaning. She's been there 2 months, alone with him and 3 ranch hands. She was a school teacher before. She was, but look at her. I mean, is it realistic, a woman of her constitution taking a teaching position, running a frontier classroom? Martha stood very still on her side of the shelf. She had become good at this over the years, the stillness, the management of her face, while her internal temperature did something entirely different. Bernard Hollis seems to think she's capable, the second woman said. She had a slightly more doubtful quality than the first, as if she was waiting to see where the conversation landed before committing. Bernard Hollis was talked into it. Mrs. Alderman lowered her voice another register, which actually made it carry more clearly. She negotiated him up to $12, you know, a woman, telling Bernard Hollis what she was worth and having him agree to it. And now the parents are supposed to send their children to learn from. I just wonder what kind of example she sets. About what exactly? About everything. A woman her size, unmarried, traveling west alone, showing up at a man's ranch after a robbery. There's talk. What kind of talk? The obvious kind. A significant pause. I'm not saying anything definite. I'm saying people notice things. Martha put the list in her apron pocket. She picked up the 2 items she'd already collected, a jar of ink and a box of chalk, and she walked around the end of the shelf and directly into the sight lines of both women. Mrs. Alderman had the grace to look startled. The other woman looked at the floor. Martha looked at Mrs. Alderman for a long moment, long enough to be clear that she'd heard, long enough that the silence acquired a particular weight. Then she said, "Good afternoon," and turned and carried her items to the counter. Her hands were steady. She kept them steady by force of will, which was not nothing. When Tom Hargrove, the store clerk, tallied her items and told her the total, she counted the correct money from her purse without hesitation and said thank you and walked out to the mare. She sat on the horse for a moment before she started back. The thing about that kind of talk, she'd been the subject of it before, in various forms, in Ohio, was that it didn't stop because you ignored it. It stopped, when it stopped at all, because you gave people something they couldn't argue with. 17 consecutive years of excellent teaching. 30 years of impeccable accounting. Some form of incontrovertible evidence that overrode the assumptions. She didn't have 17 years. She had 11 days before school started, and whatever she built after that. She turned the mare toward Bitter Creek. Cole was at the barn when she got back, working with Esteban on something with one of the fence gates that wasn't latching properly. He heard her ride in and looked up, and something in the way she dismounted, perhaps the particular quality of her stillness, made him say something brief to Esteban and walk over. "What happened?" he said. "Nothing serious." She handed him the mare's reins out of habit and then took them back because she could handle her own horse. Martha, she looked at him. I'm fine. You don't look fine. You look like someone who's been holding themselves together by choice. She turned to lead the mare toward the water trough and said, without quite meaning to, Mrs. Alderman at the saloon has theories about what I've been doing here for 2 months. He was quiet for a moment. What kind of theories? The predictable kind, about women of my constitution, and about what it means that I've been staying at a man's ranch. She concentrated on the mare at the trough. She said it in front of me. I don't think she knew I was on the other side of the shelf until I came around it. Cole said something under his breath that she chose not to hear specifically. It doesn't matter, she said. It matters. Whether it matters or not doesn't change what she thinks or what other people in that town are going to think. What changes that is the teaching. She looked at him. That's all I can do. Do the work so well they don't have an argument. You shouldn't have to make a case for yourself to people like Cole. She said his name the same way he'd said hers on the drive back from Pelham's, with a brevity that cut through. I've been making a case for myself since I was 14 years old. I know how it works. He looked at her for a long moment. His jaw was set in the way it got when he was angry and choosing not to act on it. I'm going to go talk to Bernard Hollis, he said. Don't. He should know what's being said in his town about someone he's hired. If you go defend me, she said carefully, you confirm for every person in that town that I need defending, which confirms that I can't handle myself, which is the opposite of what I need. She held his gaze. Let me fight my own fight. The anger in his face went through a shift, not disappearing, but changing into something that took her a moment to identify. It was, she thought, the particular frustration of someone who wants to help and has been told the most helpful thing they can do is stand back. I'm not good at standing back, he said. I know. She almost smiled. You can stand nearby. That's different. He looked at her for another moment, and then he nodded, once, and took the mare's reins and led the animal to the barn because she'd let him this time. And Martha went into the kitchen and put the chalk and the ink on the table and stood there for a few minutes, hands flat on the surface, just breathing. The remaining days had a quality she couldn't quite categorize. Not tense, not easy. Something in between. A sustained attention, like the air before a weather change that doesn't come. She spent time at the schoolroom in Red Rock Crossing on 3 separate occasions, cleaning it out, organizing the slates and chalk and the handful of books available, assessing what the children would need and what she'd need to build from scratch. On the second visit, a woman she hadn't met before appeared in the doorway with a small boy pressed against her side. I heard the new teacher was here, the woman said. She was young, late 20s, with the direct quality of someone who'd done a lot of work and didn't have patience for approach. I'm Helen Prescott. This is my son James. He's 9. Martha Whitmore. Martha gestured at the room. I'm sorry for the state of it. We're working on it. Helen looked around the room with a frank assessment that Martha respected. James has been learning from Mrs. Deacon for the past year. She's kind, but she... Helen glanced at her son, calibrating. She doesn't push him. Does he need pushing? Helen looked at the boy. James was looking at the shelves of slates with an expression of cautious interest. He's quick, Helen said, with the slightly defensive honesty of a mother who isn't sure how this information will be received. Quicker than we know what to do with sometimes. Good, Martha said. Quick children get bored when they're not challenged. That usually comes out sideways. Helen looked at her. A long look. My husband doesn't think a woman should be teaching. He's from Georgia, and they have particular opinions down there. What do you think? I think James needs someone who won't pat him on the head when he answers a question correctly. He needs someone who asks him the next question. A pause. Are you that kind of teacher? I am. Then we'll be there on the first day. She turned and left with James, who looked back over his shoulder once at Martha with those cautious, curious eyes, and Martha looked back at him and thought, there's one. It was enough. She'd learned in 6 years of Ohio classrooms that you didn't need all of them. You needed the ones you could get through to, and you let those become the standard, and slowly the others moved toward it. It was slow work and imperfect, and it required a quality of patience that was different from the kind you needed for other things, more active, less resigned. She was good at it. It was the thing she was genuinely good at, and she'd missed it. She told Cole about Helen Prescott that evening on the porch. He listened without interrupting, which she'd come to appreciate as his specific form of attention. "Prescott," he said when she finished. "Thomas Prescott?" "Moved up from Tucson." His wife didn't give a first name. "He's been trying to buy land on the eastern edge of town. Bernard Hollis is one of the landholders involved." Cole was quiet for a moment. "He's the kind of man who has opinions about a lot of things, and enough money that people listen to them. His wife seems to have her own opinions. Sometimes that helps, sometimes it doesn't matter." He looked at the desert. "Just be aware of him. If he decides he doesn't like the school, he can cause trouble." Martha considered this. "I'll be aware." They sat with that for a while. The evening was cooler than it had been. Not cool. Nothing was actually cool in Arizona in August. But there was a movement to the air that made it possible to breathe comfortably, and the smell of the desert at dusk was something Martha had developed a specific feeling about that she hadn't expected and couldn't entirely describe. "4 more days," Cole said. "Yes." He was quiet. She was quiet. The windmill turned. "I'm going to miss the accounts," he said. She looked at him. There was something in his face that was trying very hard to be about bookkeeping. "The accounts," she said. "They're in better shape than they've been in years." He kept his eyes on the middle distance. "Going to be difficult to keep them that way without—" "Cole?" He stopped. She looked at him for a long moment, and he looked back at her with the expression of a man who had decided that what he was not saying was more manageable than what he was. She understood. She was in the same position. She'd been in it for 3 weeks. "The accounts will be fine," she said. "I'll write down the system I've been using. It's not complicated." He nodded. "Good. And I'll be 8 miles away." "I know." "That's not far." "No," he said. "It's not." The particular silence that followed was one she'd have to keep thinking about in the weeks ahead, because it said things that neither of them had worked out how to say with words yet. The morning she left was ordinary in the wrong way, the way mornings are when you want them to feel significant and they refuse to cooperate. Dusty was up before she was, which was unusual, and she found him in the kitchen looking like he'd been there a while and wasn't sure what to do about it. He'd made coffee, badly, and was standing with a cup in both hands when she came in. "I made coffee," he said. "I see that." She took a cup and drank some. It was weak but warm. "Thank you." "Sure." He looked at the floor. "Miss Whitmore, the kids in Red Rock Crossing are going to be lucky." She looked at him. He was pink in the face and clearly hadn't planned to say it, and now didn't know what to do with having said it. "You're going to be fine, Dusty," she said. "Don't let anyone tell you that you're not smart enough to learn something. You are." His face did something complicated. "Yes, ma'am." Esteban appeared at the kitchen door and said, "Wagon's ready." And that was Esteban's way of both performing the task and giving Dusty an exit, which she suspected was not an accident. Walt came out to the yard when she brought her bag out. He shook her hand, formally, as if they were completing a business transaction, and said, "Good luck with the school." And then, after a pause that cost him something, "You're a good cook, better than what we usually get." "That's probably the nicest thing you've said to me," she told him. "Don't push it," he said, but his eyes weren't unfriendly. Cole loaded her bag into the wagon and then stood beside it while she said the rest of her goodbyes, and when she came to where he was, he held out his hand to help her up. She took it. His hand was rough and dry and considerably larger than hers, and it held hers with a steadiness that was very specifically his, and she climbed onto the wagon seat. He climbed up on the other side. They drove the 8 miles to Red Rock Crossing in the early morning quiet, when the desert was still in the phase before full heat, the colors cool and pale. She watched it go by and thought about the first time she'd seen this landscape, through the window of the stagecoach, and how foreign it had looked. It didn't look foreign anymore. It looked like somewhere she knew. At Mrs. Pelham's, he carried her bag inside and set it in the room without being asked. He stood in the doorway of the small east-facing room for a moment, looking at it. "It's decent," he said. "Good window." "I know, I chose it." He looked at her. She was standing in the middle of the room, and the morning light was coming through the east window, and she could see in his face the thing he wasn't saying, which was the same thing she was keeping her own mouth closed around. She said it differently. She said, "Come to town next Thursday. I'll have the first week's accounts from the school board to review. You can buy me a meal at the saloon since I won't have a kitchen." He understood what she was doing. She could see him understand it, the slight shift in the set of his jaw from tension to something lighter. She wasn't closing the door. She was making an appointment. She was saying, "We continue." "Thursday," he said. "Thursday." He nodded. He was about to leave. She could tell by the slight shift of his weight toward the door. And then he stopped and said, without quite looking at her, "You know what I think, Martha?" She looked at him. "I think I do. I'm not good at... I don't say things easily. I know. You don't have to say them all at once." A pause that was full of something warm and uncomfortable and real. "Thursday," he said again. "Thursday," she agreed. He left. She heard his boots on the wooden floor of the hallway, the front door, and then the sound of the wagon moving away down the main street. Martha stood in the room she'd chosen for its east window and looked at the light coming through the glass and felt something she hadn't felt since she'd stepped onto that stagecoach in Yuma. The forward pull of her own life. Not away from something, but toward. It was not a safe feeling. It wasn't supposed to be. In 3 days, she would stand in front of 14 children who had been without consistent instruction for 2 years. In a room she'd cleaned herself. With chalk, she'd negotiated into the budget and primers she'd ordered on the school board's account. She would not be perfect at it. No first day was ever perfect. And she'd learned that expectations of smoothness were the enemy of actual teaching. There would be a child who cried, and a child who refused to sit still, and a child who was smarter than she'd expected, and she would handle all of them imperfectly and try again the next day. And on Thursday, Cola Mercer would come into town and sit across from her at a table in the saloon that also served as the community gathering place, and they would look at the school board's accounts, and neither of them would say most of what they were thinking, and both of them would know it, and that would be, for now, enough. The town of Red Rock Crossing was already forming opinions about the new school teacher. Martha was aware of this in the way you became aware of weather patterns in a new place, by observation, without yet knowing how to fully read them. Thomas Prescott, she was about to learn, was a man who believed that some opinions were worth enforcing. Thomas Prescott came to the schoolroom on the 3rd day. Martha had expected him eventually. Cole's warning had given her that much. But she hadn't expected him so soon, and she hadn't expected him to bring 2 other men with him. He arrived at mid-morning when she was working with the older children on arithmetic, and the younger ones were copying letters on their slates in the back row. The door opened without a knock, and Prescott walked in with the particular authority of a man who had never developed the habit of knocking, because no one had ever required it of him. He was about 50, broad through the shoulders, with a well-maintained mustache, and the kind of clothes that were good quality without being ostentatious. A man who understood that visible wealth in a frontier town required calibration. The 2 men behind him were neither introduced nor apparently necessary for any practical function. They were there because Prescott was the kind of man who brought people with him. 14 children's heads turned. Martha had their attention for approximately 2 seconds, which she used. "Eyes on your work," she said. She said it clearly and without agitation, and 12 of the 14 returned to their slates. James Prescott, who was in the front row because she'd put the quick ones in front, looked at his father with an expression she couldn't read and then looked back at his arithmetic problem. She walked to the front of the room and faced Prescott. "Mr. Prescott," she said, "I was told you might come by. I'd have appreciated a time when school wasn't in session." He looked at the room, at the children, at the slates, at the shelf of books she'd organized, at the McGuffey readers with new bindings she'd managed to secure through a haggling session with Hollis that had taken 45 minutes and left both of them mildly irritated but satisfied. He looked at her. "I've heard some things about your background," he said. His voice was pitched at a conversational level, but not quite low enough, which she suspected was intentional. "Wanted to come see the situation myself." "What situation is that?" "The qualifications situation." He put his hands in his coat pockets. "My understanding is that your Ohio credentials were lost in a robbery, which means the school board has taken you on the word of a rancher who found you in the desert." Martha was aware that 12 slates had quietly stopped moving. "The school board has taken me on an interview and a demonstration of the material I intend to teach," she said. "Mr. Hollis sat with me for 2 hours before he offered the position." "Bernard Hollis is a shopkeeper. He's the chairman of the school board. He's not an educator." Prescott took a small step forward, not aggressive exactly, but with the confidence of someone used to occupying space. "My son is a bright boy, Miss Whitmore. He's my oldest, and I have plans for him. I came to this territory with substantial investment, and I intend to make sure my children have proper schooling." Then you'll be pleased to know James is one of the sharpest students in this room, she said. He finished yesterday's arithmetic an hour before the others, and I gave him an extension problem that stopped him for 20 minutes. That's the first time anything has stopped him in a while, I'd guess. Something moved across Prescott's face. Not quite what she'd expected, which was dismissal. It was something more complicated. He told me, he said after a moment. Good. He also told me you corrected him in front of the class. He gave me an answer he hadn't thought through completely. I asked him to go back and think through it completely. He doesn't need to be embarrassed in front of... He wasn't embarrassed, Martha said. He was challenged. Those are different things. If you'd like to discuss my methods in detail, I'm available Monday morning before school or Thursday afternoon after. Not right now, in the middle of a lesson. The room was very quiet. Even the youngest children, the ones too small to fully follow the adult conversation, were still feeling the weight of it. Prescott looked at her for a long moment. He was a man who was accustomed to the particular power of a sustained, weighted silence, and he was using it. She held his gaze without filling the silence, which was her own version of the same technique. I'll be speaking with the full school board, he said. That's your right. He turned and walked out. The two men followed him. The door swung shut. Martha stood at the front of the room for a count of 3, and then she turned to the board and wrote an arithmetic problem and said, "Let's see who gets this one first." And the room exhaled and went back to work. James Prescott looked at the problem and picked up his chalk and started without hesitating. And Martha noticed, but said nothing. Cole came Thursday as he'd said he would. She was waiting for him at the saloon, which also served food at midday, basic things done adequately, when she saw him come through the door. He'd cleaned up from ranch work, which he always did when he came to town, but there was still dust on his boots, and he never quite achieved the entirely pressed look that some of the town's men cultivated. She decided early on that she preferred this. He sat across from her, ordered coffee from the man behind the bar, and looked at her face. "Tell me," he said. She told him about Prescott, the visit, the exchange, the implied threat about the school board. Cole listened the way he always listened, without interrupting, his expression moving through something that she recognized by now as the management of controlled anger. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. What does he actually want? He wants to know the school is run the way he'd run it if he were running it. He wants influence. Does he want you gone specifically? I don't know yet. Possibly he'd accept staying if I agreed to defer to him. I won't, so it may come to the same thing. Cole drank his coffee. He was thinking, which with him looked like stillness. Prescott's been in conversation with Morrison about the eastern land parcels. She looked at him. What does that have to do with the school? Nothing directly, but Morrison is on the school board, second seat, not Hollis. And Prescott's been... He paused, choosing words. He's been making himself useful to people who have things he wants. Land, favor, standing. Martha understood the shape of it. So if he pushes for my removal, Morrison might be inclined to hear him. Might be. And Hollis? Hollis I trust. He's stubborn when he's made a decision, and he made a decision about you. Cole set his cup down. The third board member is a woman. Eleanor Fitch. School teacher herself, years ago, before she married. I don't know her position. I should talk to her. Carefully, she's private. Martha filed this. What does Prescott want with the eastern land? Water access. There's a reliable spring on the Morrison parcel, worth real money out here. She turned her coffee cup in both hands and looked at it. So Morrison might trade the school board vote for... I don't know that he'd put it in those terms to himself. Men rarely do. Cole's mouth moved in a way that wasn't quite a smile. No. They sat with the problem for a while. Around them, the saloon was doing its midday business. 3 men at the bar, a pair of ranchers at a back table, the low, continuous sound of talk and movement. Martha was aware that she and Cole, sitting across from each other at the center table, were being looked at by some of the people in the room. She was aware of this and had decided, somewhere in the first week, that she wasn't going to let it change how she sat or how close to the table she pulled her chair. There's another problem, she said. What? The Ohio credentials. She paused. He's right that I don't have documentation. The school board took Cole's word, took your word, and my word. If Prescott pressures them hard enough, they may decide they need paper proof I can't currently provide. Cole was quiet. Can you get it? I wrote to the Hargrove County School Board 3 weeks ago. I asked them to issue a copy of my credentials and mail it to the territorial office in Tucson. It takes time. How much time? 6 to 10 weeks, coming from Ohio. Which means it might not arrive before Prescott forces the issue. Yes. She looked at him. I need the school board to hold their position long enough for the documents to arrive, and I need them to want to hold it, not just feel obligated to. Cole turned his cup in his hand. It was a habit she'd noticed. He handled things when he was thinking, as if the physical contact helped him organize. What does the board need to want? Evidence that the school is working, that the children are learning, that the parents are satisfied. She paused. Which they mostly are. Helen Prescott is satisfied. She told me Tuesday that James came home and explained a mathematics concept to her that he'd never understood before. She seemed startled and pleased. Her husband's position and hers are different, are considerably, which is its own problem. Martha looked out the window at the main street of Red Rock Crossing. A woman was crossing with a basket, 2 small children trailing. A man was loading something onto a mule outside the blacksmith. It was a small town with the rhythms of a small town, repetitive, knowable, the kind of place where everyone's business was eventually everyone else's business too. She'd lived in places like this. She understood the mechanics. If I can get a handful of parents to speak to Hollis directly before Prescott has his conversation with the board, get there first. Yes, Cole nodded slowly. Who else besides Helen Prescott? The Kellerman family. Their daughter Clara is 10 and had apparently been struggling with reading since the family arrived. I found out in the first week that she's not struggling with reading. She's struggling with the way it was being taught to her. She learned differently. I changed the approach, and she's made more progress in 2 weeks than in the previous 8 months. Martha paused. Mrs. Kellerman cried when I told her. Cole looked at her steadily. Martha. It was a small thing. Any competent teacher would have. Stop. His voice was quiet but direct. Don't do that. She looked at him. You identified something no one else had caught in 8 months, he said. Don't call it small because it felt ordinary to you. She was quiet for a moment. Old habit. I know. He said it in the particular way that told her he'd been observing this pattern for a while and had made a decision to address it when it came up. It was a thing she both resented and, at some level she wasn't ready to examine closely, was grateful for. Talk to the Kellermans, and Helen Prescott, and whoever else has a child who's been helped. Do it this week before the board meeting. When is the board meeting? Typically 3rd Saturday of the month. That's 9 days. 9 days! Martha straightened in her chair. Then I have 9 days to give the board a reason to keep their position that has nothing to do with Bernard Hollis's stubbornness or your personal vouching. And I'll look into Morrison, Cole said. Find out how far along the land conversation is. If the deal isn't closed yet, Prescott needs him still. Morrison won't want to antagonize someone who can walk away from a negotiation. It was, she thought, the first time they'd operated this way. Not in parallel, each solving their own problem, but in coordination. She noticed this and decided not to comment on it directly, because naming things sometimes made them fragile before they were fully formed. Thursday next week, she said. Tell me what you find about Morrison. Same time? Same time. He finished his coffee. She finished hers. They were at the point in the conversation where either of them could have stood up and let the meeting be what it was, practical, purposeful, the kind of thing that could be filed under partnership rather than anything more complicated. He didn't stand up immediately. How's the room at Pelham's? He said. Fine. She makes coffee that's better than yours and nearly as good as mine. High praise. She'd agree with you. Martha looked at her cup. I miss the porch. She said it simply, without attaching anything to it, because it was true, and she'd gotten past the point of managing every true thing she said for how it might land. Cole received it the same way. She watched him receive it, the brief stillness, the thing that moved through his expression like weather. The porch is still there, he said. I know. He stood then, and she stood, and he put a few coins on the table for the coffee and the meal, and she let him this time without negotiating about it. They walked to the door, and outside on the main street the afternoon sun was doing what the afternoon sun in Arizona always did, which was everything it could. 9 days, he said. 9 days, she agreed. He went to his horse. She went back toward the schoolroom because there were lessons to prepare for the next day and a list of parents she needed to visit. She went to see Eleanor Fitch on Friday afternoon because Cole had said she was private and that meant she needed to be approached carefully and soon. Eleanor Fitch lived in a well-kept house at the edge of town, set back from the road behind a modest garden that was doing better than most things attempted in Arizona dirt. She was 60-something, thin, with the kind of posture that came from decades of knowing you were being watched and deciding to give the watchers something composed. She opened the door before Martha could knock. She'd seen her coming up the path. "Miss Whitmore?" she said. Not unfriendly, but provisional. "Mrs. Fitch? I'm sorry to call without arranging it. I'll be brief." Eleanor looked at her for a moment. "Come in. I'll make coffee." The house was orderly and personal in the way of a woman who'd built her own world inside it. Books, a decent writing desk, framed letters on the wall that Martha glanced at but didn't read. They sat at a small table near the window with coffee that was, in fact, very good, and Eleanor watched her with the look of a woman who had been navigating other people's opinions of her for so long that she had developed an excellent instinct for what someone actually came to say versus what they opened with. "I'm not here to ask you to take my side," Martha said. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Then what are you here for?" "I'm here because you were a teacher, and because I think you'll give me a straight answer." A pause. "What's the question?" "Is what I'm doing in that schoolroom working?" Eleanor set her cup down. "You're asking me to assess you." "Yes. I haven't been in the classroom." "You've been in the town. You talk to people. You hear things." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the garden. "Clara Kellerman," she said finally. "Mrs. Kellerman told me what you found about the way the girl learns. She's bright. She just needed a different—" "I know what she needed," Eleanor said, with a precision that told Martha she'd seen it before, had probably seen it many times, and perhaps had encountered the same approach herself. "The Harper boy. Henry. He told his mother you made him defend an answer he was certain of, and he turned out to be wrong. She said he came home and couldn't decide if he was embarrassed or impressed. He was right to be both." "Yes." Eleanor picked her cup up again. "James Prescott came to school." "He did?" "His father took him out of the Deacon arrangement specifically because Mrs. Deacon told Thomas Prescott his son was doing fine." Eleanor's eyes were steady above her cup. That was a lie. James was bored and making trouble at home because nothing was stretching him. His father didn't know what to do with it, so he decided the problem was the teaching. Martha looked at her. "You know the family. I've been in this town 11 years. I know everyone." Eleanor set her cup down a final time, with the deliberateness of someone who has decided something. "Thomas Prescott is not a stupid man. He's a controlling one, which is different. He'll push against anything he didn't originate or can't manage, but he'll accept results he can point to. If James is visibly improving, Prescott's position becomes harder to hold. And if the board meeting comes before the improvement is obvious enough," Eleanor looked at her directly, "then you'd better make sure Morrison hears from more than one person before Saturday." "I'm working on it. Work faster." There was something in Eleanor's tone that was not unkind. It was the tone of a woman who was offering the most useful thing she had, which was clarity. "I'll tell you this, Miss Whitmore. I haven't voted to remove a teacher from this school in 11 years, and I've seen 2 come and go who deserved removing. I don't vote based on what Thomas Prescott tells me to vote, but the board has to function as a board, which means I need something to point to beyond my own opinion of you, which at present is developing." Martha considered this. "Developing favorably?" "Developing honestly," Eleanor said. "Which is better?" Martha nodded. She stood, and Eleanor stood, and they shook hands with the particular firmness of 2 women who understood each other's situation without requiring it to be explained. "Thank you for the coffee," Martha said. "Come back on a Tuesday," Eleanor said. "Not to discuss the school. I have 40 years of professional experience, and so far the only person who's asked me about it is my husband, and he's been dead for 6 of them." Martha looked at her. "Tuesday," she said. Awesome. The week before the board meeting was the hardest teaching week she'd had since her first year in Ohio. It wasn't the children. The children were fine, increasingly fine. Developing the specific trust that came from consistent expectations and consistent follow-through. It was the weight of what was happening around the classroom while she was trying to focus on what was happening inside it. She was managing 2 things simultaneously, teaching and politics, and both required her full attention, and she only had one of her. She visited the Kellermans. She visited a family named Chastain whose twin boys were proving both delightful and exhausting. She visited the Harpers, whose Henry was the student she'd made defend his wrong answer, and who was now, she could tell, beginning to understand that being wrong wasn't the catastrophe he'd believed it was. That it was, in fact, the first step toward getting something right. Cole came through town on Tuesday and left a note with Mrs. Pelham because Martha was in class. She read it after school, sitting at the kitchen table in the small east-facing room. Morrison hasn't closed the deal. Land negotiations still open. He's cautious, doesn't want trouble. If Prescott's position looks expensive, M might stay neutral, working on it. See. She folded the note and put it in the same drawer where she kept the letter from the Hargrove County School Board explaining that her credential copy had been posted. She counted the weeks. The documents might arrive in time. They might not. She couldn't build her case on something that might not. On Friday, the day before the board meeting, Prescott made his second visit to the school. He came alone this time, and he came at the end of the school day when the children were filing out. He waited in the yard, and Martha saw him from the window and took an extra moment at the front of the room, checking things that didn't need checking, giving herself time to settle before she walked outside. He was looking at the building with the expression of a man assessing property. "Mr. Prescott," she said. He turned. "Miss Whitmore." He nodded at the departing children. "They seem orderly." "They're good students. James tells me you've moved on to long division." He was ready for it. He handled it well. Something shifted in his face. The same complicated thing she'd seen the first time she mentioned James. "He's been different this week, at home." She waited. "Quieter," Prescott said. "He used to ask questions we couldn't answer, and then act like it was our fault we couldn't. This week He stopped, which seemed to cost him something. He's been thinking instead of talking, working things out before he says them. That's what happens when someone gives him problems worth thinking about." Prescott looked at her. He was a controlling man. Eleanor had said it, and it was true. She could see it in how he held himself. But he was not a stupid one, and she was beginning to understand that these two facts were going to be the axis of everything between them. "I'm still going to the board meeting tomorrow," he said. "I know. I have concerns about the credential situation. The credentials are being reissued from Ohio. I expect them within the month." She met his eyes. "If you'd like to make the delay into a cause for removal, that's your choice. I'd suggest asking yourself what you're actually concerned about before you make it." He frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means that if your concern is genuinely about credentials, the answer to that concern is on its way in the mail. If your concern is about something else, about who runs this school, about whether you have influence over how your son is taught, then the credentials arriving won't solve it, because that's a different problem." She paused. "I won't run this classroom by committee. I'll consult with parents. I'll hear concerns. I'll be transparent about what I'm doing and why. But I make the decisions in that room. That's how teaching works." A long silence. "You're very direct," he said. "I found that indirect doesn't serve me well." He looked at the building again, at the yard, at the gate and the fence where children had been passing in and out for 2 weeks, leaving slight scuff marks in the dirt that were the physical record of their presence and their routine. "My wife thinks highly of you," he said. It came out with the slight reluctance of someone conceding a point they didn't want to concede. "Helen is perceptive." "She is." He said it with a brief private softness that told her something about their marriage. That whatever Thomas Prescott's controlling tendencies, he respected his wife's opinion more than he'd admit in public. "She told me James explained Euclidean concepts at the dinner table Thursday night. She said he was genuinely excited about it." Martha said nothing. She let it sit. "The board meeting is still happening," he said. "I'll be there." He nodded once, turned, and walked away down the main street. Martha watched him go and then went back inside the school and sat at her desk and put her face in her hands for approximately 30 seconds, which she felt she'd earned. Then she straightened up and started preparing Monday's lessons. The board meeting was held in the saloon, the same room where she and Cole had sat twice now, reconfigured with a long table at the front and chairs facing it. Bernard Hollis sat center, Eleanor Fitch on his right, a man named William Morrison on his left, who had the look of someone who has been professionally cautious so long it had become a form of paralysis. About 20 people filled the chairs. Parents, townsfolk, the simply curious. Martha sat in the third row. Cole was in the back, which she hadn't expected and which, when she saw him, made something in her chest settle in a way that was useful. Prescott had the floor first. He was measured, even reasonable. He framed his concern as procedural, about standards, about the appropriate verification of qualifications. He was careful not to say anything that could be characterized as personal, and Martha gave him credit for the strategy. He was good at this. Hollis let him finish. Then Hollis said, "I'd like to hear from some of the parents before we discuss this further. Helen, you had something you wanted to say." Helen Prescott stood from the second row. She did not look at her husband. She said clearly and without prelude, "My son has learned more in 2 weeks than in the previous school year. I'm not interested in removing the teacher responsible for that." A murmur through the room. Martha kept her face still. Mrs. Kellerman stood next. Then Harper. Then Chastain. Not all of them were eloquent. Mrs. Kellerman started crying again, which she seemed to find mortifying, and had to stop and collect herself. But the cumulative weight of them was something that couldn't be argued with by procedure or credential. Morrison, Martha noticed, was watching the room carefully. The land negotiation, the calculation behind his stillness. After 4 parents, Hollis said, "Miss Whitmore, anything to add?" She stood. "The credentials from Ohio are in transit. I expect them within 3 weeks. I'd ask the board to hold their position until they arrive, on the strength of what the parents have already told you." She paused. "If after they arrive there are still concerns, I'll answer them." She sat down. Eleanor Fitch said, "I'd like to move that we table this question until the credential documentation arrives from Ohio, at which point we revisit if necessary." Hollis said, "Seconded." Morrison? Morrison looked at the room one more time. He looked, Martha thought, at the parents who'd spoken. He looked at Prescott, who was sitting with the careful composure of a man watching a calculation go against him. He looked at Eleanor. "I'll second it," Morrison said. The motion passed. Martha sat in her chair in the saloon and looked at her hands in her lap and breathed carefully. Around her, people were standing, talking, moving. Prescott rose and walked toward the door, and Helen stood and followed him, and before she went through the door, she turned once and looked at Martha with a look that said several things, none of which needed words. Cole appeared at Martha's shoulder. He'd moved through the room when people started standing, and now he was there, which was where he'd said he'd be. Nearby, not instead. "Well," he said quietly. "Well," she said. 3 weeks. 3 weeks. She stood. "The documents will arrive. I know they will." "I know they will too." He said it simply, which was how he said the things he meant most. She looked at him in the crowded, buzzing room, and what she felt was complicated and real and slightly overwhelming, and she had no particular intention of managing it into something smaller than it was. "Take me back to Pelham's," she said. "I need to sit down somewhere quiet." "All right." He walked beside her out through the saloon door, into the Arizona evening that smelled of dust and something faintly mineral, the stars beginning in the east above the desert. The town was settling into its nighttime rhythms. Lamps in windows, horses at the rail, a man playing something on a harmonica somewhere that she couldn't locate. She didn't feel like she'd won. She felt like she'd bought time, which was a different thing, and whether it was enough depended on circumstances partially outside her control, which was the part of life she'd never fully made peace with. But the school was open. The children would come on Monday. Claire Kellerman would read, and James Prescott would think instead of just talking, and Henry Harper would learn that being wrong was the beginning of getting it right. That was something. That was, she told herself, not a small thing at all. The documents arrived on a Wednesday, 19 days after the board meeting. Martha was in the middle of a reading lesson when Mrs. Pelham appeared in the doorway of the schoolroom, a thing the elderly woman had never done before, which told Martha immediately that whatever had brought her there had overridden her habitual respect for working hours. She was holding a sealed envelope with the careful reverence of someone who understood what it contained. Martha held up one finger to the class and walked to the door. She took the envelope. She recognized the return address, the Territorial Education Office in Tucson, forwarding from Hargrove County, Ohio, and she turned it over once in her hands and put it in her apron pocket. "Thank you," she told Mrs. Pelham. "Aren't you going to open it?" "After school." Mrs. Pelham looked at her with the expression of a woman who had lived long enough to find certain kinds of self-control either admirable or baffling, and hadn't yet decided which this was. She left. Martha went back to the reading lesson. She opened it at her desk at 4 o'clock, when the last child had gone and the room was hers alone. She read through it carefully, the reissued credentials, the letter from the Hargrove County School Board, a note from her former superintendent that she hadn't requested, but that the man had apparently included on his own initiative, describing her 6 years of service in terms that were generous without being untrue. She folded everything along its creases and put it back in the envelope. She sat for a while in the quiet of the schoolroom that smelled of chalk and the particular dusty warmth of wood that had been absorbing desert heat all day. The slates were stacked on the shelf. The primer spines were lined up evenly, which Clara Kellerman had started doing because she liked things ordered, and Martha had let her because a child finding her own relationship to a space was not a problem to correct. The board still had the mathematics problem she'd put up that morning, half erased, the ghost of the numbers still visible. She thought about the stagecoach, about the desert and the vultures, and the 3 minutes of rest she'd allowed herself against a warm rock before she kept walking, about the envelope the robber had dropped in the dirt, her credentials, her savings, her entire constructed argument for why she belonged somewhere. She'd reconstructed the argument. It had taken longer than expected and cost more than planned and looked considerably different from the original version, but here it was, in an envelope in her hands, in a room that was hers. She went to find Bernard Hollis. He read through the documents at his store counter while she stood on the other side of it, and when he finished, he looked up and said, "Well, that settles the credential question. Yes, I'll inform the board. We'll note it in the record at the next meeting." He slid everything back into the envelope and handed it to her. "Morrison will be relieved." "Will he?" Hollis gave her the look of a man who had been conducting small-town politics for 20 years and knew when he was being gently invited to say more than he'd planned to. Morrison doesn't like conflict that doesn't resolve. Prescott made him uncomfortable, and now this resolves it, and he can go back to the land negotiation without carrying both things at once. And Prescott? Hollis was quiet for a moment. He straightened a jar on the counter that didn't need straightening. Thomas Prescott is a man who picks his fights based on whether he can win them. He's smart enough to know when the ground has shifted. He looked at her. James came to the store last week with his mother. He spent 10 minutes explaining something to me about how the angles in a triangle always add up to the same number. I didn't follow most of it, but he was lit up about it. I haven't seen that boy lit up about anything in the year and a half since the Prescotts arrived. Martha received this without comment. "Keep doing what you're doing," Hollis said. He said it gruffly, which was how he said things he meant. "The school board is behind you." She took the envelope and went back to Pelham's and sat at the small table in her room and wrote 2 letters, one to Cole telling him the documents had arrived, and one to Eleanor Fitch because she'd been going to Eleanor's on Tuesdays and she wanted her to know before the next Tuesday. Then she went to bed at a reasonable hour, which was the most radical thing she'd done in weeks. Cole came to town on Friday. He read her note when he arrived and found her at the saloon at the usual table, and he sat down and looked at her face and said, "So it's done. The credential question is done. The rest of it is ongoing. The rest of it is always ongoing." "Yes." She looked at him. "But this part is done." He ordered coffee. She already had hers. They sat with the particular ease of 2 people who had been conducting business and something else at the same table for long enough that the distinction between the two had blurred in a way neither of them was working very hard to clarify. "Prescott came to see me," Cole said. She looked up. "When?" "Tuesday. Rode out to the ranch." He wrapped both hands around his cup. "He wanted to talk about the eastern land. Said he was interested in the Bitter Creek water access for his stock if he expands the way he's planning." Martha processed this. "He wants something from you. He wants a lot of things from a lot of people. That's how he operates." Cole's expression was level. "I told him the water access wasn't available for sale or lease, and he shifted to asking about Morrison's parcel, whether I knew Morrison's position." "Do you?" "Well enough." He paused. He also said, in the way he says things, where you have to translate slightly, that he thought the school situation had been handled well, that he appreciated a direct conversation with you before the board meeting. Martha blinked. "He said that." "More or less. He made my life miserable for 3 weeks." "I know." Cole's mouth did the almost smile thing. "I think that's his version of an apology." "That's a very poor version of an apology." "It is, but from Thomas Prescott, it's probably close to the ceiling of what's available." He drank his coffee. "His wife came by the ranch the same day, separately. She came to return a pot she'd borrowed from the ranch kitchen before you arrived. Said she'd meant to bring it back for months." "She didn't borrow any pot," Martha said. "No." His eyes were steady above his cup. "She wanted to see where you'd been." She looked around the kitchen for a while and then said she was glad the school had a teacher like you, and then she left. Martha looked at the table. There was something about that, about Helen Prescott, making up a reason to see the place where Martha had started, to understand something about her that the school alone didn't convey, that she found unexpectedly moving and chose not to examine too closely at the moment. "Cole?" she said. "Yes." She looked at him directly. They'd been doing the thing for 2 months now. The appointments, the Thursday meetings, the things not quite said, and she was tired of the thing. Not of him, not of what existed between them, but of the gap between what it was and what they were calling it. "I'm not interested in continuing to pretend that Thursday is about the school accounts," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I haven't been pretending." "I know. Neither have I. But we've been polite about it in a way that's starting to feel less like patience and more like avoidance." He looked at her with the full weight of his attention, which was a thing she'd come to understand was not a small offering from him. He was a man who had learned, through years of loss and work and solitude, to be careful with what he gave. She understood this because she'd learned the same economy from different circumstances. "I don't know how to do this well," he said. "I did it once and I knew how because my wife was the one who knew how, and she led and I followed, and without that I don't—" He stopped, recalibrated. "I'm aware that I'm not easy to be with. I'm aware that I go quiet when I should speak, and that I work when I should rest, and that I've spent 8 years making the ranch the thing I'm good at because it's easier than the other things." "I know all of that," she said. "It doesn't put you off." "No." "Why not?" She thought about how to answer this honestly. "Because I've spent 31 years being told, in various ways, that I was too much of certain things and not enough of others. Too large, too direct, too willing to say what I mean and hold my position. And the men who weren't put off by that were usually the ones who wanted to manage it, who thought my directness was something to be smoothed out rather than something that was just me." She looked at him. "You've never tried to smooth me out." "I wouldn't know how," he said. "Or why." "That's exactly it." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside the saloon window, Red Rock Crossing was going about its midday business. Horses, boots on the boardwalk, a child running past the window with something in his hand that looked like it belonged to someone else. The ordinary, persistent motion of a small place. "I'd like to come to town more," he said. "Not just on Thursdays." "I'd like that. And I'd like—" He stopped again, and she let him stop. Because with Cole, the pauses were part of the sentence. "I'd like you to come back to the ranch, on weekends when school's not in session, if you want to." "I want to," she said. "I miss the porch." "The porch hasn't changed." "I know." She looked at him with the feeling of something that had been held carefully for a long time being set down deliberately in a specific place with the intention of leaving it there. "Cole, I'm not going anywhere." He looked at her. "Good," he said. And then, because he was Cole Mercer, and he could only say so much before the machinery of his restraint caught up to him, he said, "The coffee here is getting better." She laughed. It came out shorter than she expected, more surprised, and he looked almost startled by it, as if he'd forgotten the sound of a laugh in a room, the way it changed the air. "The coffee is exactly the same," she said. "Maybe I'm getting used to it." "Maybe you are, Pertishiti." The first full year passed the way first years pass, imperfectly, instructively, with moments of genuine difficulty that she hadn't anticipated, and moments of genuine satisfaction that arrived without announcement. Clara Kellerman, by October, was reading at a level that put her ahead of children 2 years her senior. She read with the particular hunger of a child who'd been locked out of something and had finally found the door. She read at her desk before school started. She read during lunch. She came to Martha on a Tuesday in November with a book she'd found at the general store and asked if it was appropriate, and Martha had looked at the spine and said, "Yes, and when you're done, we'll talk about it." "Well, api dar se bosso." She said that sentence and felt it land in her chest a specific way because it was the sentence she'd wanted teachers to say to her when she was Clara's age, and nobody had. James Prescott was harder. He was quick and he knew it, and knowing it had made him, over years of being the smartest person in most rooms he'd occupied, somewhat insufferable in the particular way of a child who had been rewarded for knowing answers rather than for asking questions. She spent most of the first semester redirecting him, not dampening the intelligence, never that, but teaching him the discipline of uncertainty, the skill of sitting with a problem before declaring it solved. The Tuesday in December when he came to her after school and said, "I was wrong about the migration problem. I worked through it again, and the error was in my second assumption, not the data," was the Tuesday she knew he was going to be all right. Not perfect. He'd be difficult for years, probably, and some of it was temperament that no teacher could fully correct. But the habit of revisiting his own thinking was in him now, and that was the thing that mattered. Thomas Prescott appeared at the school board's December meeting and said that his family was satisfied with the school's instruction and that he was withdrawing any prior reservations. He said it in the formal, slightly stiff manner of a man fulfilling a commitment to himself rather than to anyone in the room, and Martha received it in the spirit it was offered, which was genuine if graceless. He also, through an intermediary, arranged for a new stove to be delivered to the schoolroom in January, which was needed because the original one had developed a crack that let cold air in from the flue. He did not acknowledge this arrangement publicly. She did not point it out. Eleanor Fitch, on a Tuesday in February, told Martha about her years of teaching in a schoolroom in Kansas before she'd married and come west. She talked for 2 hours and drank 3 cups of coffee, and at the end said, "You're doing it right, you know, not perfectly, but right." "I make a lot of mistakes," Martha said. "Yes, the good ones always do, because they're trying enough things to get some of them wrong." Eleanor refilled her own cup. "The dangerous teachers are the ones who stop making mistakes. It means they've stopped trying anything new." Martha thought about this for several days. Cole proposed on a Saturday in March, on the porch at Bitter Creek, in the way that was entirely consistent with who he was. They'd been sitting with the desert doing its late winter shift, still cold in the evenings, the light different from summer, a quality to the silence that was softer somehow. And she'd been telling him about a letter she'd received from her mother in Ohio, the first in months, which had been cautiously positive about Arizona in the particular way of her mother acknowledging that a decision she'd opposed had worked out without quite admitting she'd opposed it. When she finished, Cole was quiet for a while in the way that had stopped meaning disengagement to her many months ago and now meant the opposite. Then he said, "I'd like to marry you." She looked at him. "I'm not going to make a performance of it," he said. "I thought about it, and I don't know how to do it with a lot of words, and I'd probably get it wrong. And I'd rather just tell you what's true, which is that I want you here. Permanently. Not visiting on weekends and going back to Pelham's on Sundays. Here." He paused. "With me." Martha looked at him for a long moment. His face in the evening light was what it always was. Weather-worn, set, not easy, but honest. She'd spent months learning to read it, and she wasn't done, which was, she'd decided, one of the best things about him. "You'd have to accept that I'm keeping the school," she said. "I know. And that I'll have opinions about how the ranch is run, and I'll say them. You've been saying them since 4:30 in the morning on the second day you were here. That ship has sailed. And some months I'll make more money than you." He looked at her with an expression of slight exasperation that she found deeply reassuring. "Martha, yes." She looked at the desert. The stars were coming up in the east. The first ones, faint, and then less faint, the way they arrived every night here in a procession that she'd never stopped finding worth watching. "Yes," she said. It was not a dramatic moment. He reached over and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat on the porch in the cooling desert evening, and the windmill turned, and neither of them said anything else for a while, because everything that needed to be said had been. They married in June at the Red Rock Crossing Saloon because it was the largest room in town that wasn't a saloon in the daytime, which was the compromise the community arrived at. Eleanor Fitch sat in the front row and wore her good dress and looked at once at a bride without particular sentimentality. Dusty cried, which he was horrified by, and Walt shook Cole's hand with the formality of a man conducting important business, and Esteban said, "Good," which was the most any of them had ever heard him say about something personal. Helen Prescott came. Thomas did not, but Helen did, and she brought James, who sat next to Clara Kellerman and spent most of the ceremony working through a mathematics problem on a small piece of paper he'd brought in his pocket, which Martha noticed and said nothing about because she understood it was his form of celebration. Mrs. Pelham cried harder than Dusty and seemed considerably less troubled by it. The accounts at Bitter Creek remained in order. Martha kept them on Sundays, which she'd claimed as paperwork mornings in the first months of the marriage. And Cole kept the ranch through the week with the precision of a man who'd made something good out of difficult ground through sheer persistent attention. They did not always agree. There were weeks when the friction between them was real, when her directness met his stubbornness at an angle that produced genuine heat, when she felt the loneliness of being known but not always understood, when he retreated into the work in the way that was his oldest and most difficult habit. These were not small things, and she didn't treat them as small, but they were workable things, and they worked them. That was the lesson she kept returning to, the one she hadn't fully known before Arizona, that the people worth choosing were not the ones who made things easy. Easy was comfort that didn't build anything. The people worth choosing were the ones who showed up in the hard sections. Not perfectly, not without complaint, but reliably. Who could sit in the difficulty with you and not need it to resolve faster than it was ready to resolve? Cole had ridden toward Vultures in the desert because he couldn't look away from what needed doing. That was still true. 4 years into their marriage, in contexts that had nothing to do with the desert. She'd seen it in how he handled a sick hand, a bad season, a neighbor's crisis. He didn't announce himself. He just came. She hoped she'd given him something equivalent, something that had held steady when holding was required. She wasn't sure, so she was bad at assessing herself charitably, but she'd tried, and she thought the trying was visible. In the fall of her 4th year at the Red Rock Crossing School, Martha had 17 students. Among them, Clara Kellerman, who read everything and would go on, years later, to become one of the first women admitted to the Territorial University and who would write to Martha about it in a letter that Martha kept in the drawer next to her marriage certificate. James Prescott, who had learned to sit with uncertainty long enough to work through it, and who his father now described at community meetings with a pride that was real, even if the man hadn't fully connected it to the teaching. Henry Harper, who no longer feared being wrong and was developing into a boy who asked better questions than most adults in the room. And new ones, each year, arriving with their particular collection of abilities and deficits and assumptions about what they were capable of. She met them where they were. She did not pretend the work was simpler than it was, or that she got it right every time, because she didn't, and children could tell when they were being managed rather than taught. On an afternoon in October, a woman came to the schoolroom door after school, a new arrival to the territory, travel-worn, carrying a bag that had seen better months, with the look Martha recognized from her own mirror 4 years ago. Someone who had come a long distance on a hope that wasn't entirely intact anymore. "I heard there was a school," the woman said. "I have a daughter. She's 7. "Bring her Monday," Martha said. "What's her name?" "Alice?" "What is Alice like?" The woman blinked as if the question wasn't what she'd expected. She draws. Constantly. Everything she sees, she draws it. "Good," Martha said. "Tell her to bring something she's drawn. We'll start from there." The woman looked at her with something moving across her face that Martha had seen before and never quite gotten used to. The specific relief of someone who had been braced for an argument and found a welcome instead. "Thank you," the woman said. "Monday," Martha said. "Don't be late. We start sharp." She went back inside. The room was quiet. The last light of October coming through the east window at a low angle that made everything look slightly burnished. She straightened a slate on the shelf. She checked the stove. She stood for a moment in the middle of the room she had made into a place that meant something, in a town that had formed opinions about her and revised most of them, in a territory that had tried to kill her the first week and had never fully made sense after that in ways she found she preferred to sense. She thought about the desert, about the vultures, patient and circling, about the rock she'd rested against in the 3 minutes she'd allowed herself before standing back up. The thing about the frontier, the thing nobody told you before you came, the thing you could only learn by staying, was that it didn't care about your plans. It took the plan, and it broke it apart and left you with the pieces. And what you built from the pieces was entirely up to you, and there was no guarantee the second structure would be better than the first. But if you were willing to stay in the difficulty long enough to find out, it sometimes turned out to be something you couldn't have imagined from Ohio. She hadn't imagined this. The school, the town, Cole's hand in hers on a desert porch in the dark. The particular way the Arizona stars arrived every evening in a procession from east to west as if they had somewhere to be. She hadn't imagined any of it. She'd imagined a plan, and the plan had been robbed from her in the desert. And what grew in its place was something that didn't have a name she'd had before. It had a name now. Several. Home. Work. Us. Outside, the windmill turned on the Bitter Creek Ranch 8 miles away, and Cole was doing whatever he was doing in the late afternoon, mending something, probably, or riding the fence line, or sitting on the porch for the 15 minutes he'd finally learned to allow himself before dark. She'd be there tonight. She'd put supper on the stove, and he'd come in with dust on his boots and sit across from her at the kitchen table where she'd once spread his accounts at 4:30 in the morning. And they'd eat, and they'd talk, and they wouldn't always understand each other completely, and they'd try again tomorrow. That was the whole of it. That was what the desert had taken her apart to give her. It was, she'd decided, more than enough.